Good evening. Good evening. My name is Mark Oakley, and I'm the Chancellor here at St Paul's. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you very warmly, each and every one of you, as we come to celebrate water and the River Thames in a variety of ways. And we're particularly grateful you have come in spite of the terrible events of the last 24 hours here in London, and know that you will all join us at the cathedral in thinking of and praying for all involved in yesterday's events. This evening's programme is the capstone of our Just Water programme, an effort across churches and cathedrals on 4 continents to draw attention to issues of water stewardship and water justice, highlighting the unique relationship each place has with its own source of water, in our case, the River Thames. And this has been done in conjunction with the United Nations World Water Day yesterday, which also coincides nicely with the season of Lent. Water, of course, having vital spiritual significance in the Christian faith and other world faiths. This evening we've come to celebrate water in all its forms, with hopes of drawing in a wide range of people with different backgrounds and different interests. And our intent is to ask us all to think carefully about something we too often just take for granted. There will be testimonies and interviews, but there will also be poetry and music about water. And I draw your attention particularly on your way out at the end of the evening to the 4 artworks hanging in the cathedral at the moment by Pablo Genovis, encouraging you to think about the relationship between the man-made and the natural world, and how St. Paul's would look if raising water levels affected us as they are affecting others. At the west end of the cathedral are a series of displays for viewing at the end of tonight's event, which will encourage us all to think about how we might engage further with this topic after tonight. And may I also encourage you to tweet on hashtag JustWater17 with I choose to, making a commitment to indicate what you will do differently regarding water as a result maybe of tonight. Of course, human willpower is such an important ingredient for change, or the lack of it. And in this year, when we recall the 500th anniversary of the reformer Martin Luther's 95 Theses, in my own gloomier moments, I remind myself of his words, that even if I knew the world was going to end tomorrow, I would still plant my apple tree. The Just Water programme will continue here at St Paul's after tonight's event with an ongoing series of Lenten evensong sermons, all on the theme of water, an event on water conflict in June, and a documentary film evening later in the year. And you can find information about all those events on the Just Water 2017 website or the St Paul's Institute website. I hope that you will enjoy this evening and be moved by what you hear and inspired to consider how your own relationship with water and the Thames might change as a result. Not least, of course, getting to know the Thames better. After all, it is the only river in Europe to have a national trail follow its entire length. And so I'd now like to hand over the proceedings to Bishop James Jones, who is your chair for the evening. He's a great friend of this cathedral and a long-standing champion of the environment among church leaders. Some people have compared the Church of England to water, well, a swimming pool actually, with all the noise coming from the shallow end. But tonight, the Church of England is well represented by someone unafraid to swim deeper. And I can think of no better person to preside over this evening's celebration of art, music and conversation. So would you please welcome Bishop James Jones.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And on your behalf, I would like to welcome our fellow travelers from around the world because by virtue of the internet, this is being streamed, this symposium, all around the world. And just before we gathered here, I was doing a Skype presentation to Trinity Church, New York, and we give them a very warm welcome. As Mark has already said, this is a symposium of music and words, poetry and statistics and tough questioning of our experts. And shortly we're going to go into poetry, so I might as well introduce her now, Jane Draycott. She is a prize-winning poet, and last year she won the Hippocrates Prize for Poetry and Medicine. That's just one of her acclaims, and we're looking forward to her taking us to places that statistics don't reach. But we have a panel of experts, and they're going to join me now, because after the poetry, we're going to get into some tough questioning. And the first person I'd like you to give a warm welcome to is Emma Howard. And Emma, I've forgotten your... Emma Howard Boyd, I beg your pardon, that's a terrible way to start. But Emma, would you please come and join me here? And when you get here, I will sing your praises, because Emma is chair of the Environment Agency, but she's also a financier who has taken a large number of initiatives in sustainable finances. And she is, for example, a director of Triodos Renewable Energies. And we're really glad to have you here representing both the private sector and also the Environment Agency, which you are currently chairing. And alongside Emma, we have Rob Fuller. Rob, please come and join us. Rob is a person who has spent a long time working with WaterAid, which is one of the biggest international charities looking at water. And Philip Fletcher is going to join us. He was chairman of the Board of Mission and Public Affairs for the Church of England, that took responsibility for its environmental policies, and he was also the very first chair of Ofwat. Thank you very much, panel, for coming and joining. Apparently, according to one former Secretary General of the United Nations, if, God forbid, there should be another world war, it would be about water. I gather that 70% of the Earth's surface is covered by water, but only 1% of that water is drinkable. Here we are in a city like New York, by the river, threatened by the river, as well as empowered by the river. I came across these statistics and I double-checked with the Environment Agency that the Thames Barrage, which was built in the early 1980s, went up 4 times in the 1980s. In the 1990s, it went up 35 times. And since the year 2000, the Thames Barrage has gone up 139 times. And when I saw those statistics and double-checked them, and I have them here if anybody wants to verify them, it made me think that if the City of London and the Palace of Westminster had been flooded as many times as the Thames Barrier has gone up in the last 30 to 40 years, then perhaps there might have been more action on climate change. But enough of statistics. Would you please give a warm welcome to Jane Draycott.
So sorry.
Thank you very much. It's a great privilege to have been invited to participate in an event such as this, in a place such as this, which has at its heart such a vital subject. I'm going to read 4 poems about rivers, principally about the Thames, but about other rivers also. The first of which is called Number 3, from Uses for the Thames. Now, some of you may be familiar, I know, with the scene from Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, where the sheep is trying to teach Alice how to row with a pair of knitting needles. And she's trying to teach Alice how to feather her oars as she brings them back across the water, flat across the water. And that's the epigraph to this poem. Number 3, from Uses for the Thames. Feather, cried the sheep. The test was to dip the needles into the dark of the swallowing mirror, and by pulling, to row the weight of your own small self through the silvery jam of its surface, trailing behind in your passing your very own tail, knitted extempore from light, and then to lift them, feathered, ready for flight. I was thinking about the particular intensity of wild swimming, as it's now called, as opposed to swimming in the shallow end, I suppose, of the swimming pool. And especially of a cardiac surgeon, a heart surgeon I had heard about, who used his early morning river swim as a time to think about and go over the coming day's operations in his head. Surgeon. He swims just before dawn, breasting the river like a hill, parting it with his arms like a dancer or priest. Ahead, a flat line of light divides the 2 dark halves of the world from each other. The air leans up to his face, and with his ears only, he senses the dark landscape of the water, its prostrate fields and struggling hedges, its low-lying ridges and flooded verges. Below the surface, pearls of half-light, silver with oxygen, cling like prayer beads to his fingers. He is thinking about the anatomy of the heart, the forks in the road, the red caves and narrow lanes, and on the horizon, the possibility of a cathedral, the sun rising like a corpuscle, winter wheat. So not far from here, a few hundred metres really, the Port of London Authority maintains a team of salvage divers who dive in the very kind of silty, murky waters of the tideway, the kind of shifting, dark waters of the tideway, searching for debris, choked material, things people have thrown in the river. And they're searching, when they dive, not with their eyes, but with their fingertips, because it's so murky down there. And this is a poem about one of those salvage divers imagining that trip to the underworld, perhaps something like Orpheus, perhaps also something like the way our own imaginations may work. Salvage. At his heels, all the bigger rooms, day, night, air, have closed their doors, as blindfold he enters the attic of the water. Like particles of sleep, mud raises itself to his mask, and with his mind's eye, he fingers the darkness for signs of her. This is the underworld of the deliberately lost, the unforeseen consequence, MOT failure, or weapon, the barges for whom the river has all got too much. Draped in silt, the debris delivers itself to his fingertips, soft as the edges of thought, as a handbrake left off, as the key to a previous door. Far off, he hears the approaching engine of her name. A deep chest knocking, and in his hand the blue flame flowers, and he begins to cut. Slowly he surfaces, and in the empty air of the house, the river runs off his face like a song. And this short last extract I'm going to read is from a translation of the beautiful medieval 14th century elegy, Pearl, known as Pearl. It's an anonymous poem, some of you may know it. It's an elegy for an infant daughter in which the bereaved father, the speaker of the poem, dreams he sees his lost child across the waters of a jeweled river on the far side. And this is how that anonymous Pearl poet imagines that river. Brightest of all were its banks, blazing with rays of beryl, a channel of light where echoing water circled and swirled in an eddying flood that was almost like words. The stream bed itself was bright with stones that shone like sunlight through glinting glass, or stars streaming deep in the winter sky, while men in this wooded world lie asleep. Every pebble that lay in the lap of that pool was an emerald or sapphire, a storehouse of jewels, so the length of the river seemed lit from within, radiant with glitter and glistening. Thank you.
Jane, thank you very much. The river runs off his face like a song. It speaks very beautifully of the gift of water. And we're here today to consider all its dimensions, but not least the beauty of this gift. In the WWF report on the planet 2016, which was launched a couple of months ago by Sir David Attenborough, they make the point that towards the end of the last century, the planet moved from what is known as the Holocene era to the Anthropocene era. In a phrase, what this means is that we moved from being a small world on a big planet to becoming a big world on a small planet. And the shortage of resources is seen in the crisis that is facing us over water. But let me ask our three panelists now if there is a crisis, and if there is, what crisis? So is there a crisis about water in the world today, Emma?
Well, I think it's a really important question that we need to ask. And I think depending on where you live in the world, the word crisis will either resonate or not. But from my perspective, looking at the issue of climate change and looking out into the long term, we need to be working today collaboratively on the sorts of solutions to deal with a number of different water-related issues. Too much, and certainly the Environment Agency, with its flood-related responsibilities, has to deal with too much water periodically. And you've already talked about the role of the Thames Barrier in relation to flood protection. Too little, and there we're talking about water shortages, which do happen periodically. And we need to be, for this country, focusing on the long term, how to build resilience around water. But we know from the sort of news that we hear about on a daily basis that other parts of the world are dealing with water shortages at crisis level today. And then I think also, importantly for our work at the Environment Agency, there's the quality of water. So for me, it's about making sure that we're thinking of water in the context of resilience, the population, the wildlife, the beauty of the world, and make sure that we're working together on those issues.
Okay, Emma. Rob, is there a crisis about water?
There is absolutely a crisis about water. And I work in international development. We love our acronyms. The acronym we use more than anything else is WASH. Now, WASH is shorthand for water, sanitation, and hygiene. And I'm going to apologise in advance because I spend much of my life banging on about the importance of toilets. And tonight will be no different. But those three are inextricable.
Well, bang on about the toilets and tell us what's the crisis about toilets.
So the crisis about toilets is 2.4 billion people, 1 in 3 of the world's population, do not have access to a safe toilet. 1 billion people still defecate in the open. And the impacts that has on the environment, on safe water sources, on health, particularly of children. About 315,000 children under 5 every year die of diseases directly related to contaminated water and poor hygiene. So yes, there is absolutely a crisis in water.
Okay. Philip, is there a crisis? What crisis?
We're in danger of violent agreement here, I think. Yes, there is a crisis. I think there is some danger that we in the developed world, specifically as Londoners, can get a bit complacent about water. We turn on a tap, we have water which is absolutely safe to drink and for most of us very palatable. We go to the loo and we can be confident that it will be flushed away safely and treated properly. And that can make us complacent, it can make us waste water, it can make us blasé about things that go wrong. I think it is, for example, absolutely right that Thames Water, the company responsible for most of London's water, was fined £20 million yesterday because of failures in sewage treatment further up the Thames. There need to be markers like that to shock us from possible complacency. But if I compare London with a city which I used to know a long time ago, Dhaka in Bangladesh, they're roughly half the inhabitants of a world city which has grown since I knew it from under 2 million to around 20 million, double and more the size of London. Half the people do not have sewage treatment, and a very substantial proportion have absolutely no reliance on clean drinking water. And that is a very bad place to be. Now, we have a responsibility, as I see it, here in the UK, to ensure not only that every citizen of the UK is properly safeguarded in relation to water, but also that we are making our proper contribution to the world crisis. And it's both a government and a charity issue, so WaterAid is very much part of this.
But how do you make an impact on the ordinary person? Because, we go home tonight, we turn on the tap, the water flows, brush our teeth. Some people just let the tap run and not think twice about the issues. So how do we break down those customs?
With great difficulty, and that complacency is a huge issue. And the water companies we've just mentioned, Thames Water, take a great deal of effort in communicating with their customers to try and talk to them about some of those challenges, about saving water, because the crisis is most impactful in the developing world. But equally, there is a water supply deficit looming in the UK as well, and the companies are facing those challenges.
And when will that begin to impact on us, the water shortage in this country?
It already is. I mean, the east of the country is very, very dry, and Anglian Water and some of the other companies working in that part of the world face those challenges on a daily basis.
And people will feel it when the water supply is cut off, presumably.
Well, I think that is something that when you get to that sort of level of water shortage are the sorts of things that do get actively considered. But I think you've got to look more broadly about how to educate people. It goes back to the points that were being made about, you just typically turn on the tap and the water is there. And I think we all can implement and use different ways of making sure that we're not using too much water, and that is something that we have to work on collaboratively and encourage people to be very mindful of the use that they have. I think you also need to work with industry, and there are a number of different ways that you can do that. We've already touched on the regulatory role that both the environmental regulator and the economic regulator can play in terms of encouraging better use of water. But I think there are other mechanisms as well, and this is where the Environment Agency, through its pension fund, working in collaboration with other investors, including the Church of England and other pension funds, can really also encourage companies to think about their performance and use of water, not just here in the UK, but globally as well. And that's where you are beginning to see some significant differences and leadership from the corporate sector.
Then let me press you, because looking out on the gathered assembly here, quite a few of us are drawing our pensions. So if you were a pensioner, what would you be able to say to your pension company about water? You said it's down to the pension company. So what leverage do we have, those of us who draw a pension?
Well, every pension fund is invested in a series of companies, and every saver has the right to ask how their fund managers are investing on their behalf for the long term. And this is where a number of pension funds who are taking that long-term view, because ultimately the pensioners are going to be living well into next century, are thinking long-term about the sorts of risks that climate change will bring to their portfolios. So those are the sorts of questions individuals can be asking their fund managers to ask the companies that they're investing in on their behalf, and raise issues around water and climate risk.
Thank you. Philip.
Bishop James, can I first of all reassure water customers in the UK, you are not going to be cut off. There is an absolute statutory bar on it, and therefore water companies have to work with customers rather than in opposition to them, to ensure that we all use this precious resource wisely. On the question of influencing the major companies, the alliance that Emma's talked about between bodies like the Church Commissioners for the Church of England and the Environment Agency pension funds and a whole lot more has brought pressure on the major oil companies, most of which, but not yet Exxon, have finally agreed that they must present proper reports on the impacts they are having on climate change. And that offers a good way forward, exercising the financial muscle which pension funds have. I actually think we are in a good position here in England and Wales, where our companies were privatised back at the end of the 80s, because although it's a very unusual mechanism, it means there's a twin drive, both public requirements and the requirements of investors to do the investment wisely and efficiently, so that between us we can bring about the better use of this resource. Can I throw in one more for the customers? Of those who are here, I would be very interested to know how many of us have our water supply metered. Well, it's a very fair proportion, but there are an awful lot of us here who do not. How can we take proper account of the water we're using unless we know how much we're using? If you haven't already thought about it, ask your water company for a meter, and they're bound to fix it free to you. We, the collective body of customers, have to pay for it in due course, but only this way can we really tie in use with cost, which is vital.
So this is a practical suggestion about water metering, but you said just a moment ago nobody's going to be cut off. I'm going to put that question to Rob. Is that true, Rob? Is nobody going to be cut off, their water supply?
In the UK, absolutely. Philip's point is right. There's a statutory duty. Water companies cannot cut off household customers, and would definitely not seek to do so either. So I think, the compare and contrast is very interesting. In the developing world, the point about meters is a really interesting point. For those lucky enough to have a household connection, meters are a standard requirement, and people have a much closer connection with the amount of water they're using, if not only because the price per unit volume you pay in many developing countries is far, far higher. An example, in the UK, you'll be paying about 7 pence for about 50 litres of drinking water from your tap. In many parts of the world, that can be as high as £1.50 for the same volume of water. And if you think of that as a proportion of income, on an average low income in the UK, it's about 0.1%. Other parts of the world, that can be 50% of your weekly income can be spent obtaining water.
And does your charity enable people to set up partnerships so that those of us who have cheap water can be related to those who find it expensive?
So WaterAid works in about 30 countries around the world, 32 countries around the world, and our work is focused in a number of areas. Fundamentally, we deliver services to the poorest and most marginalised people in society, and I think this is a really important point as well. The people who are unequally affected by the water crisis are, as with many other things, the poorest and most marginalised people, and our mission is absolutely to demonstrate if we can reach the poorest with water, sanitation and hygiene, then governments in those countries should be able to reach everyone else. So I think that's a really fundamental point. But we also work with governments. And what's really interesting comparing the situation we have here with the developing world is, we're very lucky. We have fantastic institutions, strong, robust institutions, independent regulators, skilled staff, excellent utilities delivering those services. That doesn't exist in many places in the world. So another part of the work we do is helping to build those institutions to bring that sustainability, because that's what's going to address the water crisis.
Emma, coming back to this country, you're the chair of the Environment Agency. Basically, you're responsible for sea, soil and sky, aren't you? That's a pretty big portfolio. How do you establish a priority in the Environment Agency about water?
Well, we work in different ways on the water issue, and again, part of it comes down to the priorities working with government, in particular around how we are protecting members of communities from too much water. So the flooding priority is absolutely key to us. Equally, water quality is very important as an issue. So we have another part of our organisation working absolutely in collaboration with those at a catchment level, focusing on water quality, and in partnership with the businesses, the water utility companies, who have a role as well in terms of the investment that they are now putting into water supply up and down the country. And I think it's important to recognise how much investment has gone in from the water sector to improve the quality, and the knock-on impact in terms of our water being the best quality it has been for a long time. So strong improvement in water quality, notwithstanding this is an area that we need to continue to work on in terms of making sure that there is enough water of the right quality, and that water companies and others are taking their responsibility to ensure that water quality is maintained as a standard.
And how is climate change affecting policy in the Environment Agency?
Well, the Environment Agency doesn't do policy, government does policy, so I think it's important to recognise that we are a delivery body and a regulator responding to government policy. I think one of the things I would point out is that we are seeing a greater focus on thinking about the long term. Again, that is something that the government is introducing in relation to its 25-year environment plan and ambition to create an environment that's better for the next generation. I think if you look at some of our funding mechanisms, we at the Environment Agency now have a 6-year funding settlement out to 2021 in relation to our flood resilience work, and that has enabled us to think beyond an annual basis as to how best to work up and down the country to better protect individuals from the potential for flooding. Very much focused on the number of households that we can better protect, and that is one theme that is very much coming forward in a lot of thinking in this country, is to how to move the debate to the long term. And indeed, I would also want to recognise the work of those in the water sector to equally think about long-term resilience. And the water sector as a whole came together recently to produce a report on water resilience, looking at water security out to 2065. And I think that is something that we all need to be thinking about. What are the actions that we can take today, but equally how together we can work collaboratively to think very much for the long term.
You talk about regulation, and I'm going to bring Philip in now, because you were the first chair of Ofwat, which is the regulator of water. And you gave us an example of Thames Water, who've just been fined. Why do the utility companies need this sort of regulation? Surely they're there providing a service for the public good. So a lot of the media stories would lead us to believe that really all they're interested in making a profit, and they're not quite that concerned with the public service that they're bound to deliver.
I can understand the slight scepticism, but as Emma has already said, given that at the moment these are monopoly companies, there's an important development in 10 days' time when business customers and charities can actually choose their water company, their supply company, and that's an important innovation. What have we got here? We've got, first of all, very tight regulation of monopoly, which is necessary because competition in itself won't work when you've got monopoly. But we've got standards to observe, many of them set in European directives. £120 billion, roughly, has been invested since 1989 in the sector. If this had been taxpayer financed, I don't think it would have been as much. For those of us old enough to recall, Britain was the dirty man of Europe in terms of the water sector up to 1989. We're now a lot better. The danger is back to it, complacency. And I am convinced that the water companies are broadly committed not just to making a profit, which they need to do for their shareholders, but they will only do that if they exceed the targets which have been set to them in 5-year annual reviews, which are very closely related to the required environmental outputs. So huge effort is going into ensuring that we are coping with climate change. And if I give one local example, it's the construction of an enormous tunnel under the Thames Tideway Tunnel, big enough to take 3 London buses abreast. Proceeding at the moment, yes, some of those here will be affected, but actually very few of us by the construction works because it's out of sight down there. And that is going to make a step change difference in the quality of the tidal Thames in respect of the sewage, which at the moment under the Victorian system flows directly in a flood, in a heavy rainstorm into the Thames, will now be intercepted and carry on down. It's effectively very like Sir Joseph Bazalgette, the secular saint of the sewerage system in London, who in the mid-Victorian era was largely responsible for constructing the sewers that at the moment bear the whole strain. Of course, the new investment.
Let's hope he gets a day in the calendar for the Church of England.
He's got his statue down the embankment, and I bow to it every time I pass.
But do you understand those people who say, well, look, water, nature, gift of God, you shouldn't really be privatizing something like that?
I can understand that, but somehow it has to be managed, and this is one of the lessons of climate change. Of course it can't be left to private or public companies. They will simply not do a good enough job. But customers, consumers, have an absolutely crucial role to play, and increasingly their role in this country through bodies like the Consumer Council for Water has been more and more prominent. They are setting the tone for where we should go, and part of that is correspondingly acknowledging that if the company is efficient, then we will have to pay for the improvements that we want to bring about.
Okay, let's change the subject. And Emma, you're involved in finance. You can't be involved in finance without understanding that it's part of an international network. So we've seen a change of administration in the United States of America, very different attitude emerging to things like climate change. Does that cause you concern for some of the international agreements that we need to secure in order to provide just water?
So in my moments of feeling full of doom and gloom about how agreements that were only made fairly recently might suffer as a result of a changing political environment, I think about all the effort that went in to making sure that the discussions that took place in Paris were a huge success. And in the run-up to those Paris negotiations, there was a drumbeat of positive messages coming from a whole range of different communities. The church and other religious bodies played a huge part in that. Cities did, corporates did, individuals did, and I think that groundswell of positive, we're going to make a difference at Paris, gives me a strong sense of whatever takes place in the short term, the long-term dynamic around this issue has changed, not least from those within the finance sector. So I've already talked about how pension funds have got together, understanding that they need to be investing on behalf of their pensioners and future pensioners for the long term. But that has affected their fund managers, who are also thinking much more in a focused and long-term way around climate risk. I also take great courage from the companies that have issued huge commitments to delivering on a climate change agenda. And those are the sorts of things that I think we have to remember and redouble our efforts in periods of time where perhaps there is dissent from different parts of the world.
Rob, you have a view on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've talked a lot about the crisis, about how significant it is, but the point I do want to make is we are making progress, and this is something we can do. Globally, through the United Nations, the governments of the member states of the United Nations have signed up to a set of commitments called the Sustainable Development Goals. These were signed in 2015. And these are 17 interrelated goals whose ultimate aim is to eliminate extreme poverty by 2030. And extreme poverty is defined as people who live on less than $1.25 a day. And one of those goals focuses explicitly on water, sanitation and hygiene, Goal 6. It was a goal we campaigned very heavily for. We were delighted to see it in there. So there is positivity, and I think the important point to make is solving the crisis is not a technical issue. There is no technological silver bullet that will bring water and sanitation to everyone. What is needed fundamentally is political will backed up by consistent financing. That's it. That's what we need. The SDGs is a big step forward in bringing together political will, and I'm delighted the UK government helped drive that forward. And what we need to see now is real leadership from the developed countries in delivering their commitments, because the commitments cover all nations, not just developing nations. And we need to see our government putting pressure on governments elsewhere to fulfil their commitments as well, and to back that up with suitable funding through aid mechanisms and through private sector financing mechanisms as well. So the tools are there.
Okay. I'm going to ask you each, in conclusion, to say one thing that you believe we could do to make a difference in terms of ensuring a just provision of water across the world. And while you're thinking of the answer to that question, I'm just going to say we are in conversation at the moment with Trinity Church New York, and we'd be really interested to know what your view is on the political dimension that Rob has mentioned, and what influence do you think America will have on the rest of the world when it comes to climate change and to water provision? So the question, Philip, the answer.
Well, in terms of your final point, we all wait with bated breath to find out how the US administration will actually adjust to the new order. And my prayer is that it will recognize fully the crisis which climate change represents for the one and only world that has been entrusted to us, and that we take that forward. As far as this country is concerned, I'd like to just slip in a tribute to those who work in the water sector, those who clean the sewers under our streets. Not an easy job. The engineering sector, the devotion, we can all be cynical, but the real concern to deliver good service, which is the hallmark of the great majority of those who work in the sector. And as engineers, have a contribution to make across the world because of our expertise.
Thank you. Emma?
So in terms of the one thing that people can
we
do,
could go away with saying we will do.
I think it's about taking action. And that action will be very specific to what you are doing in your lives at this point in time. But I think it is that ability to take action. So it may be supporting a charity, it may be doing something through your workplace, but it's about taking action and not just talking about an issue.
Okay, Rob?
Oh, well, Emma has nicely teed me up. It would be very remiss of me as a representative of a charity to not sit here and say one thing you could do is support WaterAid in a whole variety of ways. But I think also a very practical point that the UK government has a commitment to spend 0.7% of GDP on international aid. It's a fantastic commitment. Very few other governments around the world have made that commitment, and it's incredibly impactful, but it is under threat politically. And I think through your MPs and through your other representative channels to keep pressure on government to maintain that aid budget, and in fact to increase the water proportion of that budget would be great as well. But that is a real practical action people can help us with.
Thank you very much. Just before I left Liverpool, I heard of a couple who came into the cathedral one day, and they went up to the candle stand, and the man reached for the taper and was about to light his candle, and his wife whispered loudly in his ear, "Don't forget to make a wish." And it raises a profound theological question as to what the difference is between a wish and a prayer. But as Mark has already told us, we are in the season of Lent, and all that we've just heard now from our panelist should encourage us to bring water into our praying. But thank you very much to our panel for sharing their expertise with us. If you're still unsure about climate change, or if you have a friend who denies climate change and you wish you could lay your hands on something that would explain it to him or her, I do recommend this Ladybird book on climate change, which has been written by the Prince of Wales. It's truly wonderful because each chapter lasts only a page, and so you can really get your head around it. And there's one chapter here which is melting ice and rising sea levels. And to address that question is Professor David Vaughan. David, would you come and join us, please? David is a professor and is also chair of the British Antarctic Survey Science Strategy Team. And we could have no better person to take us into this subject, this aspect of water, which is to do with the melting ice and the rising sea levels. A warm welcome, please, to David Vaughan.
Thank you very much. In 1985, with slightly more hair, a sense of bravado and a bit of a spirit of adventure, I went to the Antarctic for the first time. Within a month of joining British Antarctic Survey, I was on a trip that lasted 5 months. I dislocated my shoulder, we abandoned ship, and I spent 3 months in a tent with one other man. We were all men in those days. Now we are more equal. And before the year was out, I was a glaciologist. I fell in love with ice, that crueler sister of water. And I fell in love with Antarctica. It's hard to describe the Antarctic landscape, which is so dominated by ice. And I can give you the facts. It contains more than 99% of the continent is covered by ice. Just less than 1% is rock that pokes out. It contains about 70% of the world's fresh water, enough to raise global sea levels by around 60 meters. And in places it's 2.5 miles deep. It's been there for 30 million years. But those are the cold facts, and it doesn't really give you an idea of what I experienced when I first went to Antarctica. It is unimaginably beautiful. And my pathetic words are really inadequate in describing it. I was asked by a local artist in Cambridge last year, Irene Wilkes, who was researching and painting, what it was like. And I said to her, imagine the most brilliant blue that you can conjure up on your palette, and then turn the volume up to 11. And you might get a sense of the eyeball-burning brightness of the Antarctic sun coming off the ice. She actually did a very good job, but I'm afraid paint on canvas didn't come close. It's actually easy enough to imagine the photographs we've all seen of the edge of the Antarctic continent, where the mountains sweep down to the sea and the glaciers bring the ice back to the ocean. But what's rarely focused on is the interior of the continent, which is completely covered in ice and is flat as far as the eye can see. My family come from the Fens in Norfolk, We're used to the flatlands. But the interior of the Antarctic continent is something that even I found difficult to come to terms with. When you can stand and turn through 360 degrees and not see one hump or mountain, just a landscape full of ice. Since that first visit, I've worked in Antarctica and I've begun to understand, I think, a little more of the planet and how interconnected it is. I've been to Greenland and I've been to Svalbard too with my work. I've been extraordinarily privileged to work to add some small quantum of knowledge to the sum of human knowledge, and begin to understand how the Antarctic works. Now, I mentioned that Antarctica is 30 million years old, but the ice in it isn't. New snow falls every summer and winter, and throughout the year that moves back towards the ocean and is deposited back as icebergs and melting water into the ocean. It's a big conveyor belt that takes a layer off the surface of the entire global ocean that's 6 millimeters thick, puts it into Antarctica, and that's balanced by ice that comes out. Almost balanced. In recent years, the satellite data that we've collected and data from people like myself working on the ice has shown that parts of Antarctica are losing ice in a way that's becoming more alarming. So why are you, the taxpayer, paying me to do this research? It is not about exploration anymore. It's not about simply understanding the planet. It's about things that affect us even here in this city today and into the future. The seas around the world are rising at around 3 millimeters a year. Doesn't sound like much, but 3 millimeters over a decade is 3 centimeters, and 3 millimeters over a century is 30 centimeters. The seas are rising as the oceans warm up and absorb heat from the atmosphere, and the water itself expands. They're rising because the glaciers in Europe, in the US Rockies, on the top of Mount Kenya and Kilimanjaro, and in New Zealand are all melting and running off and adding to the oceans. And they're rising because Antarctica and Greenland, the big ice sheets, are losing mass. The biggest uncertainties that we have about sea level rise in the future are actually in those ice sheets, in Antarctica and in Greenland. And as the water is added to the oceans, everywhere gets a share. Even the River Thames gets a share. Even a city like London can be influenced by ice that is lost by a big old brute of a glacier on the other side of the world. After the 1953 floods, which killed hundreds of people in Norfolk and almost 2,000 people in the Netherlands, the Thames Barrier was conceived, and the 120 kilometres of sea defences that work with the Thames Barrier to protect London. The job of 30 years was to build that, and we've heard the statistics of how often it was closed since it was designed. It was designed to give London a level of security that would only be breached around once in 1,000 years. If sea levels rise by just half a metre, then that level of security will go down to about once in 100 years. If it rises by a metre, which is quite possible by the end of this century, then that level of security will go down to once in 10 years. It's a very, what scientists would call, non-linear impact. So how can we address this in London? The Environment Agency knows about these statistics. It knows about the levels and the projections. And indeed, it has plans that we could defend the city, maintain that level of protection. Might cost us 50 billion euros, or 50 billion pounds, which is probably about the amount it might cost us to leave the European Union. But it could maintain that protection. For other cities around the world, Calcutta, Mumbai, Guayaquil in Ecuador, the options are fewer. They don't have that level of money to protect long city coastlines. And for the whole of the population of the world that lives in villages and towns close to the coast, that level of protection is a forlorn hope. For them, the only option is not to adapt, but to actually slow down the force that's pushing sea level rise up, which is climate change. The role of a scientist is to advise. We advise what's coming down the road and how we as a society can avoid the obstacles that are coming towards us. It's not the role of a scientist to grab the wheel and steer off wildly into the woods. Scientists are not particularly astute as a breed when it comes to economic development, issues of equity, maximizing gross global happiness. Scientists tend to be focused on one issue. But we can advise what's happening and what might happen in the future. That maxim about advice is one that I've lived with for a long time and has guided my professional life, and I tend not to talk about the options that face us. I tend to focus on my vision of what might happen in the future so that we can prepare ourselves. But once in a while, I have been known to let my guard slip. And today, in this place, with the hands of history, I think, on our shoulders, the hands of faith on our shoulders, I am inclined to speak from the heart. I feel that my generation is numbed by change. The world I was taught in when I was at school has almost disappeared. In the 30 years since I went to the Antarctic for the first time and returned and sent my first email, the very fabric of the way we interact with knowledge and other human beings has changed. While I had to go to Antarctica to understand how big the world is, I actually only need to pull out a mobile phone from my pocket to realize how small it can be. And the decisions that we face around climate change, sea level rise, poverty, conflict are actually perhaps too big for my tiny mind to grasp. It's perhaps not surprising that some have retreated into a world of fake news and of closed ears. I actually have no children of my own, and I'm going to probably leave this planet without much of a mark, except a few hundred tons of carbon that I will have emitted into the atmosphere, and a small stack of scientific papers that are already being superseded by better research and finer minds than me. But my hope for the future is collectively our children. I teach, I talk to them, and I'm very hopeful. They live in the world in a different way. They interact in a different way that breaks down national boundaries and reaches across the planet in a very easy way. The changes we've seen are just the start today in terms of climate change. We argue about the evidence in terms of graphs and statistics at the moment. In 30 years, I believe we will all have felt climate change in our own lives. We won't be arguing, we'll simply be arguing about what to do about it. So I think we have one task to complete. And put simply, it is that if we're not brave enough to make the right decisions to put future generations before ourselves, then perhaps simply we must raise a generation of children who are younger and braver than we are. Thank you.
David, bearing in mind that this is being streamed around the world, that presentation is a very sobering challenge to us all, especially when you mention cities in other parts of the globe and the threat that they live under day by day. We began with poetry, we end with rapping, and an increasingly popular rapper is Jord, and he's now going to come and bring our proceedings to an end with his poem on Just Water. Over to you, Jord.
It's just water. It's just a drink, it's just some rain, it's just some liquid. Yeah, it's just water. We don't care until it's gone away. Dip me in some water, pray and my sins are washed away. See, my name's Jordan, I'm named after a river. There's greatness by that bankside. Yeah, my name's Jordan, named after that river where our Father in heaven watched his only son being baptized. But tell me something, Heavenly Father, could there be something in the water? Because every day is getting harder. I tell a man, watch out, bang, bang, too late, another garner. But it's just water. Put some in a bottle and it could be a thirst quencher. Put some in the summer and it could be a clothes drencher. Put some in a wave and it could be a life killer. Put some in the soil and it could be a life giver. But I'm more than just a river. I'm more than just an N-word. I'm more than just a man. I'm known to put my friends first, see. I could say it subliminally and fine-tune it. I could water down my lyrics when brothers could dilute and see. I think this while I sit on the bus, going through London, far from a city of love. There's people dying for a dream, dying for a stream, and we have one running right through the middle of us. We aren't thinking of them. Are they thinking of us? Sometimes it's all about what you don't say. So I could stand here saying it's all right, it's okay. I preferred it when I was just a voice with no face. No skin color and no race. Only hope in our hearts. We think we're nothing like them, we're only oceans apart. We see the rain and we think, when's it gonna stop? But there's people in the world dying for a couple drops. But it's just water, right? We should give back to where we were brought up, right? Maybe we should treat people how they ought to, right? Help people get out their war zones, right? But that's just the way it is. If we saw the world in trouble, would we start saving it? If we saw something we didn't like, would we start changing it? It's like the feeling of compassion is alien. But now the world is burning up. We don't help people who are hurting because it's not hurting us. Why are we so hard-headed? Let's just give it to them if they can't get it. It's just water. Thank you very much.
There are two simple ways of responding to what we've heard tonight. Firstly, to take a look at the exhibition on your way out and the different stalls and the different programs that are displayed there. And the second is to complete this sentence, I choose to. So in the light of all that we've heard, I choose to what? And you can do that through joining in #JustWater17. And finally, we all know that famous parable of Jesus where he envisages the day of judgment in terms of the separation of the sheep and goats. And he talks about those who have met him in different guises. The hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the naked, the sick, and those in prison. The other day, when I was meditating on that passage, it struck me that all those categories relate to the impact of climate change. Famine, drought, refugee through flooding, destitution, disease, migrant encampments. When we see him in the hungry, the thirsty, the thirsty, the thirsty. Don't forget to make a wish tonight. Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you to all our participants.